Hello, this is Chapter 17, The Economics of Development. History is overwhelmingly a story of economies that failed to produce a set of economic rules of the game with enforcement that reduce sustained economic growth. The central issue of economic history and of economic development is to account for the evolution of political and economic institutions that create an economic environment that induces increasing productivity. As highlighted in the previous chapter, institutions and policies exert a major impact on growth and development. In addition to institutions, several other factors, including history, climate, location, demography, and technology, exert an impact on economic institutions and development. This chapter will examine how these factors have impacted human progress throughout history. The economic record of the last 1,000 years, or it's also known as the millennia. For centuries prior to 1800, per capita GDP was at or near subsistence level. People struggled sun up to sundown in order to provide food, clothing, and shelter sufficient for survival. Per capita income changed very little. It increased by about 50% between 1000 and 1820. Beginning with the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, countries in Western Europe, North America, Oceania, and Japan began to experience sustained economic growth. By 1950, the per capita GDP of the countries in these regions was almost 6 times the level of 1820. In contrast, the per capita income of the 85% of the world's population living outside of the growth regions continued to stagnate for another century and a half. However, the income level of the developing countries outside of sub-Saharan Africa has grown rapidly since 1970, and the sub-Saharan group has achieved solid growth since 2000. Prior to 1800, per capita income stagnated at or near the subsistence level, while the Industrial Revolution that began around 1800 triggered growth in Western Europe, North America, Oceania, and Japan. Its impact on the 85% of the population living in the rest of the world was minimal. And we can see this by the chart here, where the green is the high-income countries, the developing countries are in blue, and then sub-Sahara, it looks like it's red or orange, is at the bottom of the levels of GDP per capita. Some theories of development include: how can the pattern of economic development of the past 1,000 years be explained? Economic institutions are important, but other factors influence both institutional development and economic growth. This section will examine these factors and their potential importance as determinants of variations in the growth rates and income levels of countries and regions. Writing in 1798, English economist Thomas Malthus argued that income per person could never increase much above the subsistence level because, if it did, the higher income level would trigger a population boom that would soon drive income back to the subsistence level. Malthus argued that when the income level is above subsistence, population will grow exponentially, while the resource required to expand production will only grow linearly. Thus, the world is caught in a Malthusian trap. It will be impossible to sustain income above the subsistence level. Even as Malthus was writing, the Industrial Revolution and sustained growth of per capita income in the West was beginning to undermine his theory. However, per capita income in the rest of the world stagnated near subsistence levels until around 1950. Why do some nations have institutions supportive of growth and development while others do not? In a classic 2001 article, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson argue that history during the colonial era provides part of the answer. When Europeans migrated to other parts of the world, they had an incentive to establish protective institutions when they planned to settle permanently in a region. This was the case in North America and Oceania. In contrast, when the climate was hot, humid, and disease-prone, and already densely populated, the region was unfavorable for permanent settlement by Europeans. Under these circumstances, extractive institutions, minimal legal restraints preventing the seizure of resources by powerful interests, generally emerged in these regions. This was the case throughout sub-Saharan Africa and to some extent in South and Central America. According to this theory, the history of colonization exerted a major impact on the pattern of institutional development. Neoclassical production function or theory of development. According to this theory, output is a function of physical capital, human capital, and technology. Increases in the inputs as the result of investment in physical capital, improvement in education and training, and increases in technology are the driving forces underlying economic growth. The neoclassical theory provides an explanation for the breakout of the Malthusian trap and growth of per capita income during the Industrial Revolution. But the theory does not explain why investment in physical and human capital and advancement in technology occur in some countries and time periods, but not in others. Thus, it does not provide a fundamental explanation of what causes growth. Moreover, as North and Thomas state, the factors we have listed, innovation, economies of scale, education, capital accumulation, technology, etc., are not causes of growth, they actually are the growth. In geography and development, proponents of the geography theory, such as Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, argue that geographic factors such as climate, location, and access to an ocean coastline are primary determinants of economic development and growth. People living in hot, humid climates located distant from the major markets of Europe, North America, and Asia, with limited access to an ocean coastline, face major economic disadvantages. Geographic disadvantages may also exert an impact on the incentive to adopt sound institutions. Based on unattractiveness of climate conditions, distance to the world's major markets, and absence of access to an ocean coastline, 37 of the most 40 disadvantaged countries are located in sub-Saharan Africa. And here, if we take a look at the 40 most geographically disadvantaged countries, we can see what position they are in and compared to other countries around the world. Questions for thought. Why did Thomas Malthus believe that per person income could never rise much above the subsistence level? Given the era of his writings, was Malthus's view on this topic surprising? Why or why not? What are the three geographic disadvantages that Jeffrey Sachs argues have adversely affected the development process? Explain why each would tend to reduce development. The transportation communication revolution. Huge reductions in the cost of transportation and communication. During the half-century following 1970, there was a huge reduction in the cost of transportation and communication. As a result of advancements in technology and development of the internet, the cost of audio and video communication and information transmission fell so rapidly it was difficult to even estimate the size of the decline. The real cost of shipping cargo via ocean shipping fell by slightly more than 50% during 1974 through 2016. The real revenue per ton kilometer of cargo shipped via air fell by a whopping 94% during 1955 through 2019, and by 78% during 1970 to 2019. With the development and increased use of the standardized steel shipping container, the cost of loading and unloading ocean freight plunged from $48 per ton in 1956 to 18 cents in 2006, a reduction of 90%. The dramatic reduction in the cost of ocean shipping during the past half century is located here. It's shown here, ocean shipping costs as a share of cargo value declined by more than 50% during the period 1974 through 2016. The dramatic reduction of the cost of shipping air freight during the past half century shows where it was from here and how it came all the way down here. As shown, air revenue per ton kilometer fell by 78% during 1970 through 2019, and by a whopping 94% during 1955 to 2019. This transportation communication revolution shows huge reductions in the costs during the half century following 1970, exerted a dramatic impact on the world. For the first time in history, A substantial share of the world's population interacted with people in faraway countries and regions. Knowledge of economic activities and conditions increased in leaps and bounds. People in poor countries became vastly more aware of what life was like in wealthier regions, and vice versa. The Transportation Communication Revolution and Economic Development. 4 reasons why the huge reductions in transportation and communication costs will enhance economic development. Number 1, gains from expansion in international trade. Number 2, gains from increases in entrepreneurial activities and transmission of technology and successful business practices from other countries. Number 3, improvements in economic institutions. And number 4, demographic changes and the virtuous cycle of development. Lower transportation and communication costs resulted in a substantial increase in the volume of international trade. The expansion of the volume of international trade was particularly large in developing countries with the least geographic disadvantages. The rapid growth of international trade generated mutual gains from specialization in large-scale production methods. The growth of international trade of the 40 most geographically disadvantaged countries lagged behind. As shown in this chart here, international trade as a share of world GDP rose from 20% in 1960 to 30% in 1990, and then accelerated to approximately 50% of worldwide GDP during 2005 through 2017. High trade, high income, less geographically disadvantaged, and the 40 most geographically disadvantaged countries. As shown in this chart here, the international trade to GDP ratio of the high-income countries has steadily increased since 1960. For the developing countries, international trade as a share of GDP of the less geographically disadvantaged countries changed little during 1960 through 1990, but has increased sharply since 1990. In the case of geographically disadvantaged countries, the relative size of the trade sector was largely unchanged prior to 2000, but has gradually increased since. Entrepreneurs often derive important ideas from the successful production and innovative practices of others. Copycats, I guess. Businesses and entrepreneurs in developing countries can merely copy or adopt at a low cost the successful technologies and practices of the more advanced economies. The reductions in transportation and communication costs and accompanying increased interaction among people living in high and low income countries will accelerate this process. Lower shipping costs will expand the potential gains derived from reductions in trade barriers. The larger potential gains from trade will increase the incentive of businesses and entrepreneurs to pressure policymakers to adopt better policies, including trade liberalization. The Fraser Institute data indicates that both the summary economic freedom and the trade openness gap between the high income and the developing countries narrowed during the time period of 1985 to 2015. And lastly, as economic growth occurs and per capita income rises, the opportunity costs of children increases. This increase in opportunity costs will lead to a reduction in the birth rate, decline in the population share under age 50, and increase in the population share in the prime working age group. As the share of total population in the prime age group increases, labor productivity will rise, providing a boost to the growth of per capita income. Since 2000, the share of the prime age population has been declining in the high-income developed countries. This tends to reduce the growth of per capita income. The prime age group as a share of total population in the time period 1960 to 2020. The prime age, which is 25 to 59, group as a share of the total population for high-income developing and geographically disadvantaged countries is shown in the graph here. Increases in the prime age population as a share of the total enhances both productivity and economic growth. The substantial increase in the prime age population share boosted the growth rate of the high-income countries during 1970 to 2000 period, and the less geographically disadvantaged developing countries during 1990 to 2015. In contrast, the decline in the prime age population share of the high-income countries since 2000 has slowed economic growth in these countries. Entrepreneurs who have changed our lives. Malcolm McLean. You have probably never heard of Malcolm McLean, but his innovative entrepreneurial activities have vastly reduced shipping costs, expanded the gains from trade, and improved the lives of millions of people throughout the world. McLean invented and pioneered the development of the standardized steel ocean shipping container, which revolutionized international trade during the last half of the 20th century. One day in 1937, McLean was waiting for hours at a New Jersey pier as cotton bales from his truck were being loaded onto a ship. Suddenly it occurred to me, would it not be great if my trailer could simply be lifted off and placed on the ship without its contents being touched? Through innovation, strategic thinking, and determination, Malcolm McLean drastically reduced shipping costs and expanded the gains from specialization and trade that underlie our modern living standards. Here's some questions for thought. How will reductions in transportation and communication costs influence the volume of international trade? How will they influence gain from entrepreneurship? How will they impact capital investment in developing countries? Explain your response. Number 2, what is the virtuous cycle of development? How does it impact the growth of developing countries? What impact will it have on the poverty rate? Number 3, what area of the world is most affected by geographic disadvantages? How has this impacted the development of this region? The transportation communication revolution and the historic economic progress of the past 50 years. The sharp reductions in transportation and communication costs led to direct increases in the volume of trade and gains from specialization and expanded use of mass production processes. They also generated indirect gains from entrepreneurship, dissemination of technology, greater incentive to institute sound policies, and the virtuous cycle of development. These gains should be reflected in the performance of developing countries, particularly those that are less geographically disadvantaged. Growth of high income in developing countries during the last 50 years. Prior to the mid-80s, the high-income countries grew more rapidly than the less geographically disadvantaged developing countries. Since the mid-1980s, this situation has reversed. During 1985 to 2000, the average annual growth rate of the less geographically disadvantaged developing countries was 3.4%, compared to 2.1% for the high-income countries. By 2016, that growth advantage was even greater, 5% for the developing group compared to 0.8% for the high-income countries. During 2001 to 2016, even the 40 most geographically disadvantaged developing countries achieved a solid annual growth rate of 2.7%. 15-year moving average annual growth rate of real per capita GDP from 1965 to 2016. The 15-year moving average of the high-income developing and geographically disadvantaged countries is shown here on this chart. Prior to the mid-1980s, the high-income countries grew more rapidly than developing countries that are less geographically disadvantaged, but the reverse has been true in recent decades. The 15-year growth rate of per capita GDP of the less geographically disadvantaged countries in 2016 was 5%, compared to less than 1% for the high-income countries. Countries with the best and worst growth records. Except for Ireland, all of the world's 10 fastest growing economies during 1990 to 2018 were developing countries. The annual growth rate of real per capita GDP of these countries ranged from 3.8% to 8.4% during this 28-year timeframe. Populous countries including China, Myanmar, Vietnam, India, South Korea, and Bangladesh are on the list of the world's fastest growing economies. None of the countries in the high growth group had major geographic disadvantages, and most achieved substantial improvements in economic freedom during the time period from 1985 to 2017. The annual growth rate of per capita GDP of the high-income developed countries are substantially lower than those of countries in the rapid growth group. Unfortunately, developing countries dominate not only the high growth list, but also the growth with the worst economic record. The countries with the worst growth records actually had a lower per capita income in 2018 than in 1990. All of the 10 countries with falling income levels during 1990 to 2018 either faced severe geographic disadvantages or had exceedingly poor institutions, or often both. We can take a look at the GDP. China, 8.4%. Myanmar, 7.5. Vietnam, 5.4. Laos, 4.8. India, 4.6. You get the idea here. The dramatic reduction in the worldwide poverty rate. The World Bank classifies a person as living in extreme poverty if their income is less than $190 per day. The world's extreme poverty rate in 2017 was 9.2%, down from 27% in 2000 and 41.3% in 1980. Persons are classified as living in moderate poverty if their income is less than $3.20 per day. The world's moderate poverty rate was 58.6% in 1980, 49% in 2000, and 24.3% in 2017. The extreme and moderate poverty rates of the world from 1980 to 2017. You can see. As shown here, the extreme poverty rate of the world fell from 41% in 1980 to 9.2% in 2017. The moderate poverty rate fell from 58% in 1980 to 24% in 2017. We have it right here. If the poverty rates of 1980 were still present today, more than 2 billion additional people would be experiencing both extreme and moderate poverty. The transportation communication revolution versus the industrial revolution. A remarkable half century, driven by huge reductions in the cost of T&C since 1970, a large share of the developing world has escaped the Malthusian trap and achieved sustained high rates of economic growth. Worldwide poverty rates have declined more during the past 50 years than during the previous 1,000 years. Most of this progress has been in developing countries with the smallest geographic disadvantages. Since 2000, however, there is some evidence that people living in countries with more severe economic disadvantages may also be escaping the Malthusian trap. Differences between the two economic revolutions. Impact of the TC revolution has been broader. It has impacted 70% of the world's population compared to 12 to 15% for the Industrial Revolution. Growth rates during the TC revolution have been more rapid. Long-term annual growth of per capita GDP virtually never exceeded 2% prior to 1950. In contrast, during the past half century, annual growth rates of 3% or more have been commonplace among developing countries. While the Industrial Revolution increased income inequality, the TC revolution reduced it. The future of economic development. Lessons from 2 centuries of economic development. Institutions and policies that support voluntary exchange, reward discovery of better ways of doing things, and protect people and their property from the harmful acts of others encourage productive activities. History, climate, location, and technology, among other things, have exerted an impact on institutional quality and development. The history of European migration and colonialism influenced the institutions of North America, Oceania, Africa, and Latin America. Unfavorable geography, climate, and location has handicapped the development and institutional quality of countries, particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa. Technology and the huge reduction in T&C costs of the past half century have both directly influenced development and increased the incentive to adopt sound institutions. The TC revolution has been particularly beneficial for the less geographically disadvantaged developing countries. Can the economic process of the past several decades be maintained? Even though our knowledge about the institutional framework supportive of human progress is better than at any time in the past, there is no assurance sound institutions will be adopted. Institutions and policies are an outgrowth of the political process. As public choice analysis indicates, there is no assurance political decision-making, even if democratic, will lead to sound institutions. The future challenge is to bring political decision-making into closer harmony with economic policies and institutions supportive of human progress. The 2020 COVID pandemic complicates this process. Trade and interaction among people are central to development. In response to the pandemic, virtually every country has limited both. As Nobel laureate Douglass North stated, history is overwhelmingly a story of economies that failed to produce a set of economic rules of the game with enforcement that induce sustained economic growth. Questions for thought. What is the transportation communication revolution? What impact has it had on economic development? If there were no high-income developed countries like those of Western Europe, North America, and Japan, would less developed countries like Hong Kong, South Korea, China, and India have been able to grow so rapidly in recent decades? Why or why not? After centuries of stagnation, why did developing countries begin to grow during the past half century? Explain your response. Does democracy ensure that a country will adopt sound institutions and achieve a high income level? Can you name a country with a high per person income that is not democratic? Can you name a country that is democratic that does not have a high per person income? This is the end of chapter 17. Thank you for listening.